right. Excited to be on another episode of Powering the AI Stack. I'm going to hand it over to Barak today to make intros for our guests since he's known Lauri quite a bit longer than I have.
Yes,
But
but yes, but first of all, Ilya, congrats on your new gig. Do you want to tell us super quickly what
Oh
will be?
yeah, absolutely. Well, as we keep talking about powering the AI stack, I got a little, too excited and jumped in to put some hands on it. So I'm working with a startup called TensorWave that's building larger training and inference, sort of the bulk infrastructure for running some of these models, and working a little bit more closely with AMD, which is a pretty interesting sort of entry into the marketplace. So it's fun to be in residence at a startup, and it's been pretty fast pace here over the last month and a half or so.
Awesome. So best of luck on that. So yes, today we are focusing on understanding the demand dynamics and their infrastructure implications on AI stack. And I'm so excited to host my very good friend and one of the best early stage investors, Lauri Moore, partner at Bessemer Venture Partners. I'm enjoying talking to her and other folks in her firm so much that I advise them on AI as operating advisor, both to the firm and to the portfolio companies. So Lauri, very excited to host you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. As Barak said, we've known each other for many years. I won't say how many, but it's been a pleasure to debate with him from the big data era to today. So thanks for having me on both.
Awesome. Welcome again. Okay, so super quick, we will bring up and just recap the 4C framework.
Yeah, so, it's all of this AI stuff is pretty complicated, lots of moving parts. And so we found it helpful to sort of contextualize it into a couple different buckets. And so we've called it the 4Cs. You guys have seen some version of this slide every conversation we've had, but essentially there is a sort of a consumption or a demand driver, right? Folks are using these things, these tools, and that creates the need to have the kind of algorithms and sort of everything else that goes. So consumption is the first C. Then we have kind of cognition, so the models, the data, sort of the logical and digital bits that kind of make the whole thing work. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they run on a computer, right? Everybody talks about cloud, but the cloud is just somebody else's computer somewhere else. And so, there's a lot of interesting things happening at the data center and the architecture level. And then ultimately, these things are getting bigger. And at the end of the day, these things kind of plug into utility scale, power, water, telecommunications, and sort of other capacity constraints. And we've had a couple conversations where, there's some issues in getting enough power and other things to the field. And so it's great to have these buckets, but, one of the things that Barak highlights a lot is sort of the various timing mismatches. And so I'll hand it over to him for that one.
Yeah, so one of the things that I discovered very hard way, as being an AI practitioner working on cutting edge LLMs even before they were called LLMs or before they became so hot, overhyped, is that you have a huge mismatch between demand and various components of supplies. On a consumption on demand side, the demand is extremely fluid. One day we need a lot of demand, the next day we need, DeepSeek comes and there is not a lot of demand. And actually Lauri will help us kind of better predict it. Then you go to cognition, to models, and the timelines are months, 6 to 12 months to release a very good model. Then you're going to physical things and become way more complicated. When you're going to compute, building data centers and everything related to data centers, that's years, 12 to 48 months. And finally, that's one thing I learned the hard way when we were releasing first custom chips called TPUs at Google. I would come to Google infrastructure team and say, why can't you give me more GPUs quickly? And they're like, we need to build data center. I'm like, well, what's so hard about that? And they said, well, eventually the ultimate currency in everything data center related is power. And power capacity is basically power. It's like 4+ years. And in terms of CapEx investment is, it's could be up to decades, right? And you need to commit now on demand that is completely fluid. So that's why we constantly invite, and we have rotating number of luminaries in different phases in power, in data centers, etc. But obviously the hardest things, close to impossible, is to predict demand. And that's why bringing investors like Lauri to talk about it a little bit. So Lauri, again, welcome, but I actually wanted to open up and talk about one of the hottest topics that, funny part, in addition to timelines, the costs are obviously very big. It's hundreds of millions of dollars and GPUs, etc. But the fun part that we discovered with Facebook Scale AI semi-acquisition is that the cost of labeling data is very expensive, but now, believe it or not, cost of talent becomes comparable to hundreds of thousands of GPUs based on Wall Street Journal articles. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
It's just incredible. I mean, I joked with one of my partners that, well, we all hope we have a few years before we're automated away, but it seems like one of the only jobs that will be left is creating more data, labeling data, providing feedback to the models to make them better over time. And so it's just fascinating as we see both the growth in these marketplaces for labeling, reinforcement learning with human feedback, and synthetic data, and where that on balance will play out is, Barak, maybe you know better than I do, but seems like it's a race right now.
Yeah, it's a race again. Sometimes the race accelerates, sometimes it slows down, but now it's going to absolutely crazy levels. So let's get started to talk about, there is a bit of a shift, a couple of years ago, maybe a year ago, it was all about GPU constraints. There were even, VCs that would buy GPUs. VC would become friends with NVIDIA. Looks like there is a bit of a shift from that to maybe more like other bottlenecks in foundation models. Curious to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen really now, the barrier from prototype to production for most enterprises is really coming down to agentic infrastructure. And so if you think of that as the layer between cognition, compute, and consumption, what does it take to make consumption viable for the enterprise? And if you think about agentic infrastructure is really this foundational layer that lets AI agents actually do things in your business. So not just chat, but takes actions, access systems, complete tasks autonomously and securely being a key part of this. And without it, you're really just stuck with some expensive consultants or white-collared workers who are manually prompting ChatGPT. But with it, you get agents or AI systems that can actually run meaningful parts of your business. And that's when I believe enterprises will start to see real ROI and not just enticing demos come to bear.
Yeah, no, it's a great observation. My take, again, maybe slightly cynical, being in the space for a long time. A couple of years ago, people had more or less no clue. So it was all about, the bottleneck is GPUs. So let's just get a bunch of GPUs. But the bottleneck usually is not GPUs. The bottleneck is actually to develop and scale the product. Because I think, one of the biggest contributions of OpenAI, the democratized access to AI, to all those models, but it's access to try, and it's relatively easy and cheap to try and to create a demo and maybe even get money. But after that, when the rubber hits the road, it's still hard. So what's your take? What are the kind of key frameworks and tools needed to enable this transition towards more, enabling agentic infrastructure?
So there are three that I think about. One is the orchestration frameworks. So how will you coordinate amongst agents? Whereas hopefully humans that you would hire in your business have some degree of judgment, but an agent is just following whatever it is specifically set out to do. So we need orchestration frameworks like LangGraph or Crew AI or Llama Index, evaluation tools to catch failures, and observability platforms, say like Arise or Langsmith, to monitor what they actually do. And the analogy to Elastic would be something like an enterprise wouldn't deploy code without logs. We wouldn't deploy agents without some degree of visibility. And then beyond these basics, security, privacy, governance become the next blocker. How do you make sure that an agent is only accessing data on behalf of the user it's provisioned to? Barak, you have access to very different systems than Ilya, but you might both have marketing agents with a similar spec that's, running your LinkedIn post for you. But each of those agents needs to act on your behalf. So it should only have access to specific systems. It should know how to write in your voice. And as tool use becomes wider and more diversified, this tool both becomes more critical and more complex.
Yeah, and that's a great observation. And going back a little bit, what we started with, more on a serious note, the role of data quality and structure in making those agents effective, frankly, to make AI effective, because, it's otherwise it's garbage in, garbage out, looks like, cost-wise, the cost of data and people that know how to use this data effectively going up exponentially. But like, what's your take on the role of that components?
The garbage in, garbage out mantra is something we probably talked about 15 years ago
Yeah,
and still holds
not only
true.
for AI. It's exactly.
But I think what makes it even scarier today is now bad data doesn't just give you wrong answers, it can actually give you wrong actions. And so, of course, we still need clean, well-structured data that agents can reliably interpret. This is where tools like Data Hub and our portfolio, I think, can be really interesting, as they provide a data control plane that lets users and agents know what data they can access, how they can access it, and critically where and for what purpose, with the ability to provide lineage to go back and audit trail exactly what's happened.
It's kind of interesting. In past generations, we were kind of chatting about this before we went live. People are reinventing things that have been remembered or explored before. And it's actually, for me, kind of interesting watching folks take a second or third bite at some of these apples, right? Because I think the one thing, for example, IBM or some of those folks got an early look at was governance and sort of how do you prepare and access and set up data to be accessed by, models. Maybe the models weren't so good, but sort of that thought process was pretty useful. And I think for data centers, there's a couple other folks that are, I've been thinking about whether it's for mining or running cloud operations that, have a pretty good view on where the degrees of freedom are. So it seems like it'd be interesting to see kind of who are the second or third time folks on the data and even like synthetic data side. I haven't really thought about it before we were kind of chatting here.
Yeah, so I was just saying, if we remove the hype a little bit and generative or agentic, etc., at the end of the day, on the basic level, you could call it even AI foundation, but frankly, it's a data foundation. And part of the challenge that some of the enterprises are not even ready, they don't have the data infrastructure fully ready yet, right? So I'm curious, if you kind of try to, from your observation, obviously a lot of your portfolio companies are selling to enterprises. In terms of timelines, when do you think enterprise will be ready? Because that's such a fundamental either inhibitor or dependency, right, for a effective deployment of AI or agentic models.
Yeah, absolutely. But Barak, you and I joked about this before, that it felt like 2 years ago, all of a sudden, our friends who are working on like truly cutting edge ML got labeled overnight traditional ML.
Yeah, old, not LLM.
Not LLM, it's traditional. And Ilya, to your point, a lot of the foundations that are needed today are either certainly analogous to a lot of what was needed in a traditional ML development, but with some very interesting differences. There might be a level of trust that you could have with a human in terms of what data that they would access, where with an agent, you really need everything specified in a clear way. And so in terms of timeline, I think there's more of an appreciation in this era, perhaps because of that rhyming, that this is happening. There's not an enterprise leader that I talk to that's not just has declared fait accompli that the movement to AI and an agentic first way of building will happen. Andre Karpathy recently said it's going to be the decade of agents. I think that might be how long it takes for humans to catch up to this way of living and working. Kids who are in middle school today, like my own oldest daughter, are learning AI natively, and in 10 years, this will be just starting to enter the workforce. But even this year, the best estimates I've seen predict that 1 in 4 enterprises is already looking to deploy AI agents. So I think there's this real sense that enterprises are fighting to prevent the innovator's dilemma and leverage the data advantages that they have, the customer footprint or user footprint that they have, to avoid being left behind in a way that I certainly haven't seen in past waves. So that's been really interesting. And Rob, we should ask you as the AI leader of one of these enterprises.
Well, I wanted to add fun/cynical to repeat what I told when we had lunch with BVP folks, Lauri, is that overnight LLM became so hot. But I remember like 2018 that I was talking to CEOs, execs, VCs, not you, Lauri, and I would tell them about LLMs, and people would like the more more polite of them like roll their eyes and pretend to be interested, and more blunt would just say, why the heck you telling me all this crap? It's not relevant to anyone. It's like, yeah, it's relevant to Google. So, it's funny to see this evolution. And now, including those people today going to CNBC, I always saw it coming and it's eating the world, etc. As I said, it's good to, some people have very great sense of timing, right? Maybe it was too early. But yeah, it's exciting to look at that. But to your point, it's like, back to my point, yes, we are in a great place in terms of trying and experimenting on AI, but there's still a lot of hard work to make it ready and actually scale it. And it depends on different industries, it depends on different use cases, etc. Switching gears and talk about models, and again back to the point of Facebook is saying my foundational model, I want to develop super intelligence, but there's a lot of models, right? The leaderboards changing every 6 months. People are fixated about and spending a lot of time and money and efforts to be first for 6 months, and then they're not first, right? So what do you think is happening in terms of, model consolidation and evolution of the infrastructure, where it's going from your perspective?
Yeah, you just made me think. One of the things that's been really interesting is to see how the model providers, developer tools have gotten better. It enables founders to just focus on what it is that they are going to do really well, which for an early stage company is to be having some technical or market insight. Barak, you're talking about the 2017, 2018 days when I was a founder at that time. And I remember in my pitch deck, I even had a slide that had to explain, this is what a transformer model is. This is what we talked about NLP. Let's define what NLP is. And so we had to spend time even on.
I still have that deck. I'm still presenting it to Stanford GSB, what NLP,
yeah.
why, and I had a slide why it's important.
Why it's important. Totally. And if I think back even 2 years ago, at the beginning of a pitch, most founders would address, are they planning to build their own foundational model, or do they think they can rely on these startups of OpenAI or Anthropic? And it felt a little scary. And today, they don't even address which model they're using typically, because there's this sense that they're going to either use the Anthropic API or Claude API, and so typically what we see is they're consolidating to maybe one kind of general use case model, so a frontier model like GPT-4 or Claude for complex reasoning, and then a smaller, faster model that perhaps is fine-tuned for their very specific use case.
Yeah, domain specific.
So that they're operating efficiently. And managing multiple models becomes like a whack-a-mole of prompt engineering. And so it feels, I think that the benefit of not having to do that has come from believing that there's a lot more stability in those foundations. And if they need to, they can swap out one API for the other.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And back to, powering AI stack, obviously there's a connection between demand and then more digital supply, let's say models, and then, GPUs and power. What do you think is happening, as we said, everybody were fixated about GPU constraint. It's not over. I mean, because nobody can predict demand, right? But it's kind of, we talked about a bit of a shift to agentic infrastructure, but how do you think it's shifting? Like, what is it shifting from, foundational model providers? Where do you think it's going?
Yeah, this is another one that I think has been a huge boon to early stage startups. 2 years ago, early stage startups had to address how are they going to get A100s for what they're trying to do. And
not only startups, by the way.
Yeah. It became the true limiter in innovation. And now it's something that effectively most startups don't talk about. It shifted to the foundational model providers to address. And there is still a crunch, as you two well know, but there is an assumption that I can hit at the even tooling or application layer, I can hit my OpenAI or Anthropic API and it'll just work for me.
Yeah. Can you elaborate on the crunch or like the limitations that you see on foundational models? That's probably interesting angle for many people.
Yeah, well, and at the foundational model providers, that's where the crunch has moved to, especially for when they've been able to hit product market fit really quickly. Like let's say Anthropic, Claude for coding, where Cursor will pass through Claude, which is and other models, but Claude is the heavily preferred model
Yes,
for
on code
engineers.
development. Yep.
And so when they need to throttle because they're not able to get as much access as they want, then you see like a true backlash from
I
engineers.
see.
Who
Well,
just
it looks like at the back end, it's probably still related to GPUs, but it's way more nuanced, right? It depends on freshness and, latency expectations, etc. No, and by the way, that's normal. So back to, at the end of the day, there are still, there is a model and model ability and there are SLAs, etc. But at the end of the day, there is also providers of GPU infrastructure. So there is top 3 or maybe top 4, they're all now trading. And by the way, Corvig is providing to Google and buying from Google, etc. So what's your take on, role of those, let's call it new clouds and Neoclouds that are coming? What's kind of role of those alternative providers in like, did it help in democratize access?
I think it does. And Ilya, you should probably take this one as well. But I think this cheaper inference for middle scale workloads and that gives enterprise a real alternative. I think one of the most benevolent things that it does is it forces the hyperscalers to compete on more than just convenience.
Yeah, and the thing I would add, as these folks are actually scaling their kind of DevOps and operational footprint, the difference between traditional cloud and sort of AI cloud is your utilization is nuts, right? It's like 80%, 90%. So where it made sense to go to the cloud for twice a year where your website would need to scale, 100x, now your sort of baseline demand is very high. And so you make different decisions. And Barak and I have talked about this before, but it's really interesting because there are a whole host of folks doing interesting things with video and others that are actually still kind of rolling their own models. And as that model scales to needing to stay fresh and train, and then also kind of deliver inference, like the capacity of your plant, like what your throughput actually is from your physical data center becomes like a important competitive advantage. Because if you got to wait, 3 seconds more for your video to generate, like the user experience hit of that is pretty high. And so that's been sort of a blast from the past in some ways, but kind of a interesting surprise for me.
Yeah, and by the way, I think that's where we're going to crux of this discussion about our 4 Cs, because yes, it's like, yes, demand is way less predictable by the nature of the demand, right? Supply is way more fixed, but it doesn't mean that you cannot try to optimize it, right? And that's why we're bringing experts from different fields to try to understand what's going on. So what does it mean that we have proliferation of all those, GPU alternative providers? What does it mean in terms of, reserve capacity and ability to plan? Because that's very critical to people, and that's the mismatch. By the way, believe it or not, you ask me about, GM or even Google. All those things are very relevant to a lot of things. GPU or data center capacity, if you look at cars, it's exactly the same thing. You're now predicting what EV demand will look like, and you commit billions of dollars now that will to be ready for 5 years, right? So it's applicable to so many places when you touch physical things. So curious, both Ilya and Lauri, like, what does it actually mean? Do you think we are now more flexible in terms of our ability to be more flexible on reserved capacity, or we still need to plan way ahead?
I think what's interesting is that there's not and Barak, maybe this is what you're observing as well, there's not a moment or an obvious way that this is solved. So I think what we've seen is enterprise infrastructure planning has simultaneously gotten simpler in some ways and more complex. And simpler because maybe you're not buying GPUs directly, you're buying API credits or SLAs. But then it's more complex because you need to think about enablers to model switching, provider redundancy, cost optimization across different vendors. And so now the reserve capacity is diversified, but or maybe you're not thinking about hardware commitments as much, but you're still thinking about alternative vendors.
Yeah, and hardware is still behind the scenes. Any thoughts? I have
Yeah.
a couple of
And
thoughts.
they're
But
thinking about hardware, even if the enterprise isn't directly thinking about hardware.
yes, exactly right. Ilya, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, quite a few. I mean, I think it really depends what you're doing, right? Like one of the things that people really learned is cloud affordability. Once you scale an application, you really got to keep an eye on it, right? And I think that's like triply true here. And so I think a lot of kind of conversation about total cost of ownership and ultimately kind of what's the throughput here. And it's interesting because as you're sort of testing and playing, a lot of more capacity is there sort of on the spot market, right? And people even able to sort of support you as you deliver a system. But if you need a model that's very fresh that you're sort of training and fine tuning, right, that doesn't really help you. And so there's a lot of what are you doing? And what's crazy is like a lot of teams are starting with really good model and data folks, and then sort of missing the what does this work at scale question, right? And so not a lot of folks had your experience, Barak, with, I'm here to request the TPU allocation for my thing. And that's a really important kind of sharpening
I was kind of spoiled
experience.
because TPUs were developed for my team. So that's very rare. I would also say is that, like, I'm curious, Ilya and Lauri, if you observe it, I observe that even with these alternative providers, the cutting edge hardware at a very flexible allocation comes at a cost that you need to be a big client. If you're a mid-sized client, it's not that flexible. They literally may be spoiled with demand. So that's what I felt not only with big cloud providers, but even with, alternative like, providers. It's the same thing. Like if you're coming with a big millions in orders immediately, then they are very flexible. If you're coming below that, they're kind of, right? So it really depends.
I think that's true. I think ultimately is because sort of power capacity and maybe a little bit of a difference between the clouds and the Neoclouds is the Neoclouds are very specialized on to the, kind of AI workload. The clouds are a little bit less specialized. And so it's a different conversation. But for the folks that are really specialized, it makes more sense to sort of support and schedule into power and data center capacity that's available, right? And so I think there will be more things that serve folks, kind of in a fluid, dynamic way. But it's sort of easier and faster to be able to support, larger and more complex type of deployments, because there's a lot of overhead that comes from virtualization and sort of context switching and all the things that you have to do in order to accommodate, truly shared facilities. Yeah, and there's also a lot of, obviously security and other considerations as well.
Right. And Ilya, I think you wanted to touch, I like your notion of capacity cascade effect. Maybe you can elaborate on that and we can have a discussion about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think we're sort of into it already, right? Sort of the point was that there isn't as much competition for GPUs at the earlier stage startups because it's been pushed out into the frontier models because kind of demand has consolidated.
It's not there. It's
obscure. Yeah. And so, I think the term I sort of flippantly came up with is capacity cascade. I don't know if it's a good term yet, but, the idea is that sort of this competition for resource and GPU capacity is still very real. If you look at the OpenAIs and sort of Oracle, Meta, both in recs for positions as well as sort of capital spend for CapEx, it's very real, right? There's last year was $420 billion, something like that. This year is probably going to be more. And people are that's a very real constrained world, right? And then there's actually some folks that are sort of floating into that are doing these, video models and other things that aren't part of the, core part of the frontier models today, right? And we were talking about a lot of interesting chemistry, physics, sort of other models that aren't sort of the strong part of the frontier. And so they're still battling out for kind of hardware, GPU, data center capacity. And then there's a lot of, other work to do that you can do with feeding through Claude or feeding through OpenAI or kind of others. And so it seems like we've gone from a one hump camel to a two hump camel, right? Where there's sort of a blip on the physical infrastructure, power, data side, and then another blip on, And maybe this second hump has a few more dimensions, right? Where there is now, where do I get my data from, right? Can I secure sort of the team and resources to have access to it? And, sort of the, how do I fine tune or offer a durable, differentiated offering into the marketplace?
Yeah.
And so, I would say one hump camel to two hump camel is sort of the analogy I'm thinking about right now.
And Lauri, to pick up on one thing that you mentioned about the throttling, right? So the moment you start scaling, how does that impact, like you're probably talking to companies, and when it happens, how does that impact users? How it impacts ARR? How it impacts growth prospects of those startups?
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of taking the camel analogy way too far, I think the camel is on a treadmill, so to speak, as these better models make users expect AI everywhere. They back to your point on latency and throttling. Once users are now putting AI in the mix of critical workflows, like coding is probably where we have the most mature adoption, but increasingly diverse use cases. When it becomes part of one's workflow and you get throttled, it becomes just the rage that you feel from users, I think, is one of the surest fire signs of true product market fit. But as those users expect AI everywhere, they expect it to be fast and inexpensive, then it increases the compute requirements faster than infrastructure can scale.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. But, there is also some tricks. And actually, as I said, I'm not that old, but I sometimes feel like, elder when people talking about distillation of DeepSeek. We tried to deal with it many years ago at Google when we released first LLM, and we dealt with some of the user experience innovations, time to first token, and how you can actually, it's not, maybe it doesn't need to come immediately, even though at Google it was pretty religious. I remember when our initial inference was like end-to-end inference on Google Translate with first LLM model in 2016. 7 billion model, small in current standards, was 100x slower than before, and Google was religious at that time. So I told my folks, do me a favor, when you're going to present to Larry, just tell me the date that will present this latency. I will be out of town, right? So I don't want to be there. But if you think what even, OpenAI did initially, time to first token is very fast, and then you're doing this typing, right? But there is more techniques on that deep research with, delayed output. For some use case, it works great. Like, I don't know, in Harvey, if you need a memo and you take 10 minutes, that will be a very innovative technique to deal with inference and deal with some of the throttling. So I'm just curious, what's your thoughts on those?
Yeah, and Barak, I think you cited some really good technical solutions for dealing where models are today. One of me being a product manager at heart, I always really appreciate when I see companies using product and UX to meet customers where they are with models as they are today. Like a great example of this, remember it was a couple of years ago, SourceGraph was one of the first to employ citations. So you can use AI-driven search to ask a question about code. And it's probably going to be correct, but just to make sure, here's a citation of exactly where I got this information from, and to set the user expectations around, this is a helpful solution that can maybe save you some time, but check your work, look at the actual citation, go to the source of truth. And in Claude today, it was a big improvement when they added the ability to pause when the model is thinking too long, but you maybe wanted a quick answer. And I think user experience PMs from OpenAI and Anthropic, both I've heard, like everyone recognizes that today the user experience of having to know which model name you want for which purpose is far less than ideal. But instead, meet the user in their vernacular, their use case, and then provide the solution using the optimal model, optimal thinking time. I think there's a lot of product and UX innovation that we're still waiting for.
Yeah, no, that's great insight. So, going back to, as we said, industry, I would not say matured, but evolved, right? Because we were very early and it was all understanding of, it's like, oh, let's just take ChatGPT and use it. And oh, we cannot use it because it's, we need GPUs. Now it's evolved to way more nuanced. Okay, we need to develop a product and we need to think through all those things. But at the end of the day, it comes back to this feedback cycle, demand on the top and then, demand, and then you have cognition and compute, right? You have models and compute. What do you think about this feedback cycles? Do you feel startups like have this deep understanding, or they just staying on the level of like, it's abstracted from me, I don't worry about it. If it's throttled by Anthropic or whoever, I will just try to deal with it. How startups are dealing with this, feedback cycle?
I think and again, it depends on the layer that they're building. If they're building at the infrastructure layer versus the application layer, I think at the application layer, and I'd be curious what you do think, but rightly so, most that I see are building with the assumption that models will be fast, ubiquitous, and free or expensive. And I think that's right, that they should spend, the existential question for them is, can I solve a big enterprise pain point that exists today, fast enough that it can get to continue to exist, and with the assumption that underpinning them will be increasingly powerful infrastructure. At the infrastructure layer, there is an interesting question of building too early means you're solving tomorrow's problems with today infrastructure and you're burning cash waiting for the market to catch up. But building too late means that you miss the land grab for when enterprise budgets unlock. So if you can figure out the sort of infrastructure arbitrage, building when the core capabilities exist, but the tooling is not yet, we'll say, beloved. And I always think about how Stripe launched when payment APIs existed, but were terrible to use. And so now we're seeing a similar dynamic in the agentic world. Foundation models can do the work, but orchestration, monitoring, deployment are still quite primitive.
Yeah, no, it's a great observation. My take is that working, many years at Google and working with a lot of clients, that in many cases, the realizations that different use cases require different solution is lacking, right? Because if you're Google or Facebook, you need, based on the use case, you need a big model by default, right? Because you have huge, domain, like it's basically every domain. It needs to be very accurate because of the expectation, and it needs to be very fresh, right? And low latency. But in enterprise, in many cases, you could play with those. You can play on, hey, my domain is narrow and not like very broad, right? As to your point, I'm a big believer on domain specific models. I might be able to play on latency, right? Latency for legal brief is different than latency for search, right? So a lot of the things people in many cases kind of gravitate to, let me take the best model that is very big. And by the way, I don't think it'll be free. I don't think it'll be fast immediately because it's a very capable model, right? So I think, and you also need to take into account, yes, let's face it, Google is one of the best, business models in history. It's very different margins and in different industries. So I think there is still, it's becoming better and better, but there is still, to some extent, expectation, everything needs to be super fast, super accurate, super fresh every time. And that demands, it puts strains on everything. But, looking at this now, what do you think the investment implications for downstream infrastructure providers, all the way from, model providers to, more importantly, data center, capacity, power, etc. What's your take on that from investment perspective? There's people putting hundreds of billions of dollars into, power and everything.
Barak, I think this is where our perspectives show some of our fun differences, and you have public investors that you need to answer to tomorrow, and I'm investing at the early stage where we try to squint and imagine what the world is going to look like in 10 years.
Yes.
A lot will change in that time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, public investors also theoretically trying to predict whether you need more power or less power, and in 10 years, because they're investing hundreds of billions of dollars now. But yes, you have the ability, you have way more flexibility, which is super, super helpful. We have like 4 or 5 minutes, so I just wanted to kind of discuss, begin three of us, when do you think all those, back to the point about, infrastructure, or like those AI foundational technologies across data and tools and frameworks and capabilities. When do you think, those key enabling technologies will mature? I think we are early, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts, you, Ilya, and you, Lauri.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I spent half a decade at an engineering procurement construction company. And so I know that, doing anything new is a combination of people, systems, and technology. And so the technology is blowing up. The people and systems, especially in sort of the broader world,
I would call it processes
is a whole different. Yeah. But one pressing thing that I've been kind of watching that wasn't or hasn't traditionally been around is sort of this private equity, folks thinking about, all right, well, if we can't sell to the enterprise, can we sort of use private equity to come into the enterprise stack? And so I'm like watching some folks in renewable energy deployment and things like that say, hey, why don't we just rebuild this engineering company, right? And it's a very interesting and sort of different approach. So I think some of those folks, especially for things like renewable generation, could force the pace in a pretty significant way. Now, some of them, don't really understand how some of those industries work. But in some cases, that's a superpower. In other cases, like the physical world has a lot of. So I think there is some interesting things there. And then I think there's, a lot of good balance between how do you get people excited versus how do you deliver for real, because it's very hard to maintain a pace of investment in an enterprise if it's not showing up on the balance sheet. And sort of that translation of interesting, fascinating to moving the needle is a thing that I think is different for different industries. And so I think in some it will work really well, and in others it's not going to be, it's going to be more of a flash in the pan in the sort of 3 to 5 year time frame.
Yeah, if I think about when we should expect that consumption circle to expand meaningfully, the couple of signals I still watch religiously. One, API pricing trajectories. We saw foundational model costs drop 10x in a year with GPT-4, which just unlocks entirely new use cases that wouldn't have been economically meaningful previously. Early adopters like developers going from 0 to 100 million in revenue for Cursor in the shortest timelines we'd ever seen. And then I think that the signal that I'm watching most closely right now is when we start to see Fortune 500 companies buying AI tools with annual contracts as opposed to pilot budgets. That's sort of the most recent inflection point that will then lead them to not just buy more tools at the application layer, but also really start to think about their own AI infrastructure as they're making those investments for the long term, not for prototyping and hack days.
As a Fortune 20 company, as the chief AI officer of Fortune 20 company, Lauri, I cannot say much, but you're spot on.
We'll talk offline, off camera.
The interesting thing is, in sort of the whole powering the AI stack and the 4C idea is I think the one thing we know for sure is we're going to be wrong, whether it's too big, too small. And I feel like this sort of last part of the conversation is introducing another part where, we're probably not going to hit the Goldilocks table. We're going to sit on the small chair or the big chair, but it's not going to be quite right. So I think it's almost fitting in some ways. But it's cool that, I think the signal of getting into the official procurement process, that's a good one to watch. And it's great to kind of hear your perspective and helping shine some light on this. So.
Yeah, and that's why I love this series, because we're bringing smart people like Lauri. And yes, we will be wrong from time to time. It will evolve, but it's important to understand those signals, understand this complexity, because people just oversimplify it, and then they're making those decisions that are in general complex because there's a mismatch of timelines. So we are at times, but Lauri, it was a pleasure as always. I think we have now topics for 3 lunches to talk about offline, but it was a pleasure to have you on this session, and best of luck in this exciting time of investing in AI infrastructure and AI applications.
Thank you both so much for having me on and for the fun discussion.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.